Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, an economic meltdown and a freeze on cash withdrawals. Desperate Lebanese depositors are holding up their own banks to get access to their life savings. So, what's the way out of the financial crisis? Also this week, China is owed almost 40% of poor countries' debt payments this year and is under pressure to help strained economies overhaul their credit burdens. So, what can Beijing do? Plus, drought threatening Zimbabwe's crops and raising fears over food insecurity. Zimbabwean farmers are going back to old farming techniques to cope with extreme weather conditions. The World Bank says that Lebanon's economic crisis may be one of the 3 worst in modern times, and it's left 8 in 10 people poor. Many Lebanese people can't afford basic necessities, and those who have life savings in banks can't access them. Withdrawals have been limited since the financial meltdown began in 2019. Now, desperate depositors are robbing banks across the cash-strapped country to get hold of their own money. So how did Lebanon get to this point? Well, successive Lebanese governments, which are accused of corruption and mismanagement, racked up huge debts. In 2019, it became clear that the state had no capacity to finance its debts, including to the country's commercial banks. Lebanon's financial system is estimated to have lost more than $70 billion. And banks say they don't have enough dollars to pay depositors. They've imposed informal capital controls and have offered savers with US dollar accounts Lebanese lira to withdraw their money instead. But the local currency has lost around 95% of its value since the crisis started. And the country's GDP plunged more than $20 billion last year. The government can't afford basic services with long hours of electricity blackouts and medicine shortages. Well, we've met one depositor who tried to retrieve his cash by force. Here's what he had to say.
My name is Bassam Al-Sheikh Hussein, and I have $210,000 in my account. It's my money that I earn from work and from selling my apartment and my parents' house. My dad has a serious medical condition, and I needed money. I went to the bank manager, and he promised to help me once the bank got cash. But 2.5 months passed, and he still didn't give me money. I went to the bank and asked if it was available, and the manager said no. I went to my car to get the gun and fuel. I entered the bank and locked the door and demanded all of my deposits. I poured fuel everywhere. I told the employees not to get involved and no one would get hurt. 3 negotiators representing the government arrived. Initially, they wanted to give me $10,000 and hours later, they offered $16,000. Again, I refused. It was around 5 or 6 p.m. when they offered me $30,000. They then gave me $35,000 in cash, which I got, and they promised me $400 a day and said I would not be detained. I agreed, even though I knew they were liars. I surrendered, but they detained me for 5 days because the bank filed charges against me, and I never received the $400 payments. My life has been destroyed since the local currency devalued, and I lost my job. I won't rest until I get my money back. It is a life or death choice. The Interior Minister should arrest those who took our money, not us. I will exercise my rights any way I can, even if it involves blood. I will never give up.
Well, to discuss all of this, we're joined now from Beirut by Sami Attallah. Sami is the founding director of the Beirut-based independent think tank, the Policy Initiative. Good to have you with us, Sami. The Banking Association there in Lebanon says that banks are going to remain shut indefinitely following this series of hold-ups. I mean, does closing banks make the situation better or worse?
Well, definitely it's not going to help the situation, but let me just stop at the word hold-ups. These are not hold-ups or bank robberies, as the Banking Association is saying. In fact, a robbery is when you actually have someone or an act where someone is going into a bank to steal other people's money. What we're actually seeing in Lebanon right now is that people are going into the bank to take their own money, but by force. And there's a huge difference with that, because a lot of people in Lebanon feel like that the banking sector has actually robbed them of their own money. And since 2019, as you know, we have not been able to access all our deposits. Only the rich and the powerful have managed to transfer more than $15 billion out of the country, whereby individuals like ourselves are left to deal with the consequences of the collapse.
The World Bank has accused Lebanese politicians of staging a Ponzi scheme that has, quote, caused unprecedented social and economic pain over the last 3 decades. What do you make of that accusation?
Yes, absolutely. You've got the political establishment that has mismanaged the economy for many years. And here we're talking about since the end of the Civil War, whereby they ran major structural deficit in the economy, and particularly I'm talking about the public deficit, public budget deficit, and the trade deficit, which means they've allowed a policy whereby they're spending way more money than they're actually collecting for the treasury, and they're actually importing way more goods than they're exporting, which led to a policy where you have to keep on attracting capital into Lebanon to finance these two deficits. And there were many warnings about this policy to stop it, to rectify it. The government and the consecutive Lebanese governments, where they're all to be blamed, all the political parties that took power, did not do anything about it, but they actually kept these policies intact. And the central bank came to facilitate the financing of such a scheme, whereby they attracted people to put their money in Lebanon, when the interest rates were higher than other places in the world. And in fact, the banking sector got so greedy into this, where they actually invested 70% of their portfolio into the state, central bank and the government, and hence mismanaged our own money and led to this major Ponzi scheme, which ended up, with a total financial and social collapse that you're talking about. So there's a lot of people to be blamed here. The political establishment, the government, the parliament that has also failed to do anything about it. In fact, they facilitated this by hijacking economic reforms as well. The central bank was the architect of this policy, and the banking sector, they benefited the most of this, and they made a lot of profits before the crisis at our expense.
All right, so here's the million-dollar question. How does Lebanon get out of this financial mess?
The prescription to get out of the mess is very clear here. The roadmap is clear. The set of policies that need to be in place are clear, and many people have been talking about them, and they're very straightforward. You need to have a capital control law to stop the money leaving the country. You need a bank restructuring law. You need to audit the central bank, and so forth. The prescriptions of what to do are straightforward. But here's the issue. The government has refused to conduct any of these or implement any of these reforms in the last 3 years. This is unheard of, whereby a country is witnessing a social and economic collapse for the last 3 years, and the state, the government, the parliament hasn't done anything to protect the people. So they don't want to do these reforms. In fact, they've protected the banks, and they've protected their own interests, and they're refusing to do any of these. There have been 6 or 7 drafts of the capital control law in parliament, and we haven't been able to implement any of these. So this is a situation whereby the political elite wants to protect its interests, is refusing to, in fact, conduct any of these reforms, despite even IMF's insistence that these are going to be preconditions for any future loans. And yesterday was in fact an IMF delegation here criticizing the Lebanese government for not doing its job.
But Sami, this situation can't go on indefinitely. How do you see it coming to an end?
The problem is we have only 6 to 9 months money to buy imports, from the central bank reserves. So clearly the time is ticking. There's no more time to kick the can away, as the Lebanese politicians have been doing that for the last 20 years. Their time is up, and the solution needs to be implemented. Now, the question is, will they have the will to actually undertake reforms, which they have failed to do for the last 20 years? or they will actually pretend they're doing the reforms and dilute them in such a way that they actually blackmail the donor community to actually give money to Lebanon so people don't go hungry and at all. So the situation, again, the technical situation, the technical solution to the problem is very clear. The prescriptions are very clear, but they refuse to hold them because it's highly political for these political elite and their own financial and economic interests in the country. So they're going to have to choose. Either they're going to bring the whole country down, which they've already done so, and even more so, or they take responsibility and put it on track. They have failed to do that. So I'm expecting that things are going to get worse in Lebanon, and we're going to go into a very uncertain period.
Sami, thanks for explaining all that for us. Really appreciate it. Many thanks indeed.
Sure.
Almost 70% of the world's poorest countries will have to repay at least $52 billion in debt this year. And more than a quarter of that money will go to China. Much of the loans are linked to infrastructure projects as part of the Chinese President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, many of Beijing's borrowers are not able to meet their financial obligations. The International Monetary Fund says that China and other big creditors have a responsibility to prevent debt problems exploding. The IMF estimates that 25% of emerging market and 60% of low-income countries were in or near debt distress. China says that it will forgive 23 interest-free loans to 17 African nations and redirect $10 billion worth of its IMF reserves to Africa. Well, China is one of the world's largest single creditor nations, and researchers have found that around 60% of Beijing's overseas lending is now to low-income countries which are in debt distress or at high risk of it. Its loans to lower and middle-income countries are estimated to have tripled over the past decade, reaching more than $170 billion by the end of 2020. Aid Data, a US-based research lab, says that Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Argentina are three of the largest recipients of Chinese rescue lending. Most nations share information about their lending activities through membership of what's known as the Paris Club, but China isn't part of that group and doesn't publish records of its foreign loans. Well, joining us now from Hong Kong is Carlos Casanova, a senior economist at Union Bancaire Privée, or UBP. Carlos, good to have you with us on counting the cost. What's your take then on this issue of Chinese loans? As creditors, what sort of people are they to borrow from?
Thanks for having me on the show. So China has in fact become a much larger creditor in the past decade, or since the launch of its Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Of course, China's financial assistance differs slightly to that offered by other lenders such as the IMF or other members of the OECD-led Paris Club, in that it doesn't come with added conditionality. And by conditionality, we mean political reforms, austerity, and other conditions that are not always very popular amongst some emerging countries. So China is able to navigate the political risks because it doesn't have to abide by OECD norms for lending, so it bundles its financial assistance with other commercial aspects, for example, involving some of the state-owned enterprises, agreeing to repayments in commodities as well as US dollars. And so in that way, it is able to perhaps tap areas of the emerging world that are not well serviced by existing lenders, the IMF and other developed countries.
But does the fact that China does things differently pose a risk both to lender and borrower?
Well, there is a reason why the largest lenders, such as the IMF and the ADB, are not able to do some of the things that China is able to do. Typically, we are looking at countries where the sovereign risk is higher, and that projects where the returns or the visibility in terms of future returns are not as clear as in other parts of the world. I think the main thing that entices countries to take on these sorts of credits from China is the Chinese economic miracle. Everybody wants to have a similar narrative in their country. China has been very successful in eradicating poverty over the past decade. So everybody wants a slice of that pie too. But of course, when projects turn sour or when the cost of servicing the debt and maintaining the infrastructure becomes prohibitive, then you have countries that stumble into stress and debt service, cannot service their short-term debt, and have to incur sovereign defaults.
But if countries can't afford to pay back their debt to China, what risk does that pose to the Chinese economy?
So as I mentioned, China is able to partially offset some of this risk by allowing the repayment to take shape in the form of commodities. Historically, this has been very advantageous for China in places such as Venezuela or Zambia with oil and copper exports. It is not perhaps as strong a driver in places such as Sri Lanka, and we can talk about that as well, where the main commodity that we would be looking at is exports of tea. So there, they have more risk, and we are seeing that risk pan out into a more complex discussion around the country's debt restructuring efforts with the IMF, and also the role that China is playing in that conversation. Is
China becoming a competitor to the IMF and the World Bank, or do they work in tandem, in partnership?
I think they work in tandem. China is becoming a bigger creditor. So in a sense, emerging markets, especially those that have not been able to access financing from the IMF, or emerging countries that have been frustrated with the lack of progress in the IMF in terms of representation of emerging markets within the fund, they are increasingly, or they have been increasingly, turning to China as an alternative. So in a sense, it is competing. But of course, the nature of Chinese aid is very different to that of the IMF. The magnitude of Belt and Road infrastructure investments to date is, of course, smaller compared to what the IMF has done, given its longer track record. So for me and for emerging markets in this more complex global environment, I think it's important that both are working in tandem to minimize risks.
With some nations now struggling to pay back their debt to China, what does that mean for the Belt and Road Initiative? And could China scale back its lending to countries?
In fact, we have already seen this. Since 2019, we have seen infrastructure spending under the Belt and Road actually decrease significantly. Part of the reason was that many countries in the emerging world experienced a decline in GDP and revenues following from the pandemic. Going forward, the stress is slightly different because we are looking at a very hawkish Fed, rising rates, lower liquidity and inflation. Also within China, some of the risks have started to pile. So we see difficult conversations in places such as Sri Lanka. And of course, with the domestic economy also entering a phase of a slower activity, the appetite or the domestic sentiment towards offering some of these riskier loans to emerging markets is lower than it has been before. So our expectation is that we will continue to see a deceleration in Belt and Road projects over the coming years. And hopefully, once all of the uncertainty surrounding rising risks of recession in the US and everything that's happening with the Fed is over, we might see a pickup in activity once again.
Carlos, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Now, sustainable finance, it's largely defined as investment decisions based not only on financial returns, as investors traditionally expect, but also with an eye on environmental, social and governance, or ESG factors. Put simply, investing money in projects that can make the world a better place. Renewable energy, for example. Global sustainable investing assets reached almost $35 trillion in 2020. But what is ESG exactly? We put that question to Zoe Knight, the group head of HSBC, Centre of Sustainable Finance, and head of climate change, MENAT.
ESG is still abstract, right? I mean, it's a bit of a mystery to most people what the social aspect means, what governance means, and what environmental means. But if you drill it down, the whole agenda is about people. It's about access to employment and jobs. Like, how are people's jobs going to be impacted by this climate agenda? It's about sort of the access to money for change, how we govern change, like how we deliver a stronger, more prosperous economy that works for everybody. We know that the science is telling us to get to a net zero emissions framework by 2050. And we know that finance must provide capital to the solutions and must think about the consequences of warmer temperatures and how that might affect our clients and affect their ability to operate and their business models.
Well, ESG factors are now front and centre for governments and businesses here in the Gulf, with the potential of unlocking $2 trillion in economic growth and more than 1 million jobs by 2030. Zoe Knight says the region is looking at investments in carbon capture and hydrogen to make the energy transition.
This region is abundant in energy, and it's providing energy services to the entire world. Equally, it will be host to the climate talks in November this year and November next year. That gives the region an opportunity to create its own narrative on an energy future, an energy vision, how the climate transition plan will play out across the Gulf. The task of Egypt in COP27 is to show the implementation that is going on the ground, to really showcase projects on decarbonisation that are work in progress now. They're in train, whether it's green hydrogen, whether it's carbon capture and storage, how that is shifting the way that energy flows work today.
Well, last year's climate summit saw banks, insurers and investors with $130 trillion in assets pledging to help wean the world off fossil fuels.
We've set a target on financing of up to $1 trillion over the next 8 years to support the sustainable finance transition agenda. That's mission critical. What we're also doing is working with external coalitions to build the framework for what transition looks like across different sectors and industries. And we're doing that in conjunction with an initiative that came out of the Glasgow climate talks, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. So what we find is by collaborating across both other banks and with our clients and with industries and governments and regulators, we can discuss the challenges and discuss the barriers for change and figure out how finance can really unblock them and commercialise activities that perhaps haven't been commercialised in the past.
Now, Zimbabwe is facing growing food shortages and farmers are resorting to old farming techniques to cope with extreme weather conditions. Clay pot irrigation can save large amounts of water without depriving crops. Al Jazeera's Haramatasa reports now from the town of Chegutu.
Teresa Dlamini's garden is thriving. Under this lid, sunk up to its neck into the ground, is one of several clay pots irrigating her tomatoes. This alternative way of growing food is ideal for Zimbabwe, a country prone to drought and where people don't get regular supplies of piped water from the council.
Even when there is no water, my vegetables are always green. It's been days without water here, but the clay pots are always watering my tomatoes.
Using clay pots to water crops is not a new farming technique. It's used in other parts of the world, and now it's gaining traction in Zimbabwe.
The clay pots have some small, tiny, invisible pores that are used for water seeping. The water that is inside the clay, it seeps around the crops at a radius of 40 centimeters. So the plants around the radius of 40 centimeters gets the water.
Rising food prices, higher fuel costs and inflation at 285% in August means many families are battling.
Zimbabwe's government plans to distribute food aid to more than 2 million vulnerable families from October. That number is expected to go up next year. It's not just rural households. People in urban areas are also going hungry.
Underprivileged communities often run out of food in October, the driest period before the rainy season. The UN also plans to assist.
Urban hunger is something that we have started to see more during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's something that is fairly new. As you know, the World Food Programme used to work mainly in the rural areas. But now we have started to send some pockets in cities and towns where there is urban hunger.
The clay pots cost $5 each. Buying in bulk can be expensive, so communities also use plastic bottles with holes poked into them. They work just as well. For some families in urban areas, these water-saving techniques are a lifeline, helping them grow food for themselves and sometimes a little extra to sell. Harumutasa, Al Jazeera, Chigutu, Zimbabwe.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, you can tweet me. I'm at A. Finnegan on Twitter. If you can, please use the hashtag AJCTC. Or you can drop us a line. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.